And I
Yes.
want to welcome everyone to our newest Lyceum. We are celebrating a 200th birthday of the UAU, and Reverend Catie will be explaining what all of this history is and some of them very key people. So it's nice to have some of our own history explained. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Catie.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I'm going to, I'm going to spotlight myself. Hi, everybody. And we're going to attempt, those of you who came to my Lane Lyceum long ago, when I came back from sabbatical, saw how badly everything went with the technology, but we've now further tested it. And I have hopes that maybe it's not going to be a mess this time. We'll find out together. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, get this started. Ooh. Y'all just let me and Amy know if there's something you can't see that you think you're supposed to see. That's how we phrase it in our Vesper services. So this is happy 200th to us. Good evening, everyone. Delighted you're here to learn about some of our spiritual ancestors and our history, those involved in founding the American Unitarian Association, the AUA's founding, and key players are important to us because First Parish is a historically Unitarian congregation. And because in 1961, the AUA consolidated, as they describe it, with the Universalist Church of America to form the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which First Parish in Needham is a member congregation today. Let's see here. Let's work. Yay. All right. Oh, it did. Nope, it doesn't do that though. Sorry. Okay. I find it personally helpful to know generally what to expect when embarking on an unfamiliar topic, or even one that is familiar. So here you all can see an outline of where we're headed tonight. We're starting with New England Puritans, then we're going to have a brief detour within that to explain the theological fissures that appeared in the late 18th century. Then we'll discuss major events and leaders of the widening split between those Puritans who would eventually become Unitarian and Congregationalist. And then we'll lead into May 25th, 1825, this very short time period that led into a separate Unitarian organization, and then finally founding of the AUA and its direction in its first year. And just so you all know that, like, yes, we will be talking about a lot of 19th century Greater Boston white guys this evening. These are the key players here. And also, we may, in our detour, hear about some maybe white guys in Turkey and Europe from earlier centuries. So hopefully that at least is exciting to you all. So let's get started with those Puritans, which included us at the First Parish Church in Needham, Massachusetts, founded along with the town of Needham on November 17th, 1711, which is like a kind of palindrome, in case you two want to sear that date into your mind. If you can't read that neat little historical sign that's in this picture, this is the sign that's along Dedham Avenue on our sidewalk near the Memorial Garden. Don't worry if you can't read it, though. It tells you absolutely nothing relevant to the topic we're discussing this evening. So, why do First Parish and the town of Needham share a birthday? That's because legally and governmentally, we were essentially the same thing. Massachusetts was founded as a theocracy with its basis in the Cambridge Platform, a 1648 document that served as Massachusetts's religious constitution until 1780. And in fact, there was not a full separation of church and state in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts until about 50 years after the Revolutionary War. That's partly in thanks to our Unitarian ancestor from Quincy, John Adams, who you may know of as the second president of the United States. Puritans sought freedom of religion from the Church of England, but they created a remarkably similar system to what they fled in Britain. As the Unitarian Universalist Association explains it, in colonial Puritan New England, each town was organized around its church. The members of the church were those who had made a confession to the Christian faith, while the members of the parish were those who hadn't had a religious experience of conversion, but still lived in the town and paid the poll tax that supported the church budget. The minister was the spiritual leader of the church, as well as the teacher of public morals to the townspeople. These were the standing order churches, church and parish in the same institution, with religious leader and public preacher in the same person. Importantly, First Parish is a standing order church that was financially supported through taxes. Also importantly, every church member signed into the local church's covenant, which is essentially still the basis of First Parish membership today. And only members of the church could vote on church matters, except for the parish-wide vote that was needed to call a new minister. This separation between the church members and the parish members is going to become very important a little bit later. So I ask you to please try to keep that in mind. In the late 1700s, these standing order Puritan churches, with their standing order Puritan ministers, began to show signs of theological disagreement. And there are two theological disagreements of primary importance, one of which certainly you have heard of or can assume. The other one you might not know about. So we're going to talk about it. All right. The first is that some of these Puritan ministers in our area began preaching about a Jesus with a focus on his humanity instead of on his Trinitarian equality as part of the Godhead. And that brings us on our journey, our first one, to the past, the farther past. In the year 325 CE, all the way in Nicaea in what is now Turkey. For about 300 years, Christians had been heavily and violently persecuted by the ruling Roman Empire. But then, in the 4th century CE, Emperor Constantine I's mother, Helena, converted to Christianity, and then he converted. And this began a very different era for Christians, becoming rulers in an empire instead of persecuted by empire. And that's a sermon for a different day. For now, it's important to know that Constantine wanted his new faith to be governed as a tight-run ship, no theological or ecclesiological arguments or differences between various regions and communities, or at least not any important ones. And one very big disagreement in 325 CE was between Arius and Athanasius and between their followers. Athanasius was a proto-Trinitarian, believing that God was unified yet distinct as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Arius was a proto-Unitarian, believing that the prophet Jesus was not the same as God, was not eternal as God the Father was. So Emperor Constantine needed the Christian bishops to sort that all out, and he called for the first ecumenical council in Nicaea. And this, the following summary I'll have for you of that council, it comes from Greek Christian church historian Socrates Scholasticus, or Socrates of Constantinople, writing in the 5th century, but quoting 4th century church historian Eusebius Pamphilus, or Eusebius of Caesarea, who attended and voted at the Council of Nicaea. So Eusebius wrote, "The most distinguished of God's ministers from all the churches which abounded in Europe, Africa, and Asia assembled here. There were more than 300 bishops, while the number of elders, deacons, and the like was almost incalculable. Some of these ministers of God were eminent for their wisdom, some for their strict living and patient endurance of persecution, and others for all three. Some were venerable because of their age, others were conspicuous for their youth and mental vigor, and others were only just appointed. The emperor provided them all with plenty of food." The various sides in the conflict each raised their own points, and from the start there was a tremendous argument. The emperor listened to them all patiently, impartially, and attentively, considering everything that was said. He spoke in support of one side and then the other, and that way gradually softens the bitterness of the conflict with his mildness and affability. When anyone spoke well, he applauded. urging them to be of one mind, he eventually succeeded in bringing them to agreement on all the issues before them. They were united in the confession of faith. So there's a little bit of white lying happening here. There's a lot of talking about how great Constantine was. You have to do that. He's the emperor. And they were definitely not united by the end of the council, but that's fine. We'll get into that. Some of you may recognize, actually, that united in the confession of faith. You might recognize the first part of the confession of faith decided upon at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. It goes, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ. This is the section that goes on for a bit, for those of you unfamiliar. The Son of God, the only begotten of the Father, of the substance of the Father, God of God, and light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, of the same substance as the Father, by whom all things were made in heaven and on earth, who for the sake of us men and our salvation descended, became incarnate, and was made man, suffered, arose again on the third day, and ascended into the heavens, from where he will come again to judge the living and the dead. And in the Holy Spirit. Okay, that's the last. So I grew up learning that in the Catholic Church. So it took until I was in seminary to learn that the Greek word repeatedly used for the same substance was created for this Nicene Creed. Constantine and the assembled bishops had to create a new word to describe the Christian Trinity because they could not agree on any word that already existed. Nothing was mysterious enough. And I didn't grow up learning the second part of that confession, this part of the Nicene Creed, which is this: the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church anathemizes those Arians, this is with an I, Arians who say there was a time when Jesus was not, and before Jesus was begotten, he did not exist, and Jesus was made from that which did not exist. The same goes for those who assert that he is of a different substance or essence from the Father, or that he was created or can be changed. And after that council was adjourned, Constantine exiled Arius and all those who believed, as he did, that Jesus was of a different substance than God, and all of Arius's writings were destroyed. We really only know about him from the writings of Athanasius, the victor in that council, who just talks about how bad Arius is all the time, which is why at right, this is the history we have. At right, you can see this very beautiful and respectful icon in Ukraine of Athanasius. That's in contrast to, at the left, a fresco in Turkey that depicts Nicholas of Myra slapping Arius in the face during the Council of Nicaea. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is the same Saint Nick that you have heard of. It was Santa Claus. Okay. I thought it would also be fun to show you all another piece of art that kind of demonstrates how Trinitarian Christians felt about our spiritual ancestor Arius. In this icon found in Greece, there Arius is on the floor after losing. Poor Arius. And poor anyone who ever thought similarly to Arius in the centuries that followed, because they were frequently exiled or murdered. Which is what we're getting to the next, if I can get this thing to move. There we go. The notable exception to Arians and those like them being murdered was, and this was before the 1800s, there was a small blip of time in Transylvania under King John Sigismund, where it was okay to be a Unitarian. Sigismund was converted to Unitarianism, and after a council of his own, or a diet, that he called in Torda, the 1569 Edict of Torda declared religious tolerance for Jews, Christians, including Unitarians, and Muslims. In this painting, you can see our spiritual ancestor, Reverend Francis David, preaching and teaching at the Diet of Torda. But unfortunately, this Edict of Tolerance ended after King Sigismund's death, just 2 years later in 1571. And discrimination and oppression of Unitarians in Transylvania started back up again, though the Transylvanian Unitarian Church continues till this day. And so now we'll move along. Oh, that's right. I said there were two of them. So the first fissure within Puritanism was between mainline Trinitarians and resurgent yet heretical Unitarians. But the second theological fissure was of equal importance. to both sides, though we don't hear about it as often. And this is Arminian versus Calvinist, or free will versus predestination. It's answering the question, how is it decided whether a person spends eternity in heaven with God or in hell with demons? And who decides that? Who influences that decision? During the 16th century Protestant Reformation, both German theologian and minister Martin Luther and French theologian and pastor John Calvin broke with the Roman Catholic doctrine that faith without works is dead. They believed that one was saved by grace, God's grace alone. And Calvin took the idea that God's grace alone saves farther than Luther did. Calvin's Reformed Christian tradition held and holds that God predestines certain people for heaven and certain other people for hell, regardless of their conduct on earth, or even their faith. Though in Puritan New England, folks generally assumed you could guess who was heading where by whether they showed signs of God's grace, like good behavior, the right faith tradition, and even just good luck. And early Puritans were very much Calvinists. Some of you may have heard of John Calvin in other contexts generally, but also in other Unitarian history contexts, because it was Calvin who ordered, or at least allowed, for Spanish doctor and theologian Miguel Serveto to be burned at the stake for his heresy of Unitarianism. Arminianism is named for 16th century Dutch theologian and pastor Jacobus Arminius. Calvin died shortly after Arminius was born, but Arminius was trained by Calvin's chosen successor, and he decided he didn't agree that predestination was a biblically sound theology. Arminius instead believed that God did not have a pre-selected elect, but that heaven was earned by a person's faith. Arminius's heresy was tried and convicted at The Hague in the Netherlands, now much better known for being the city housing the United Nations International Court of Justice. I guess this was a different court at the time. Soon after Arminius's death, his followers were legally and systematically exiled or imprisoned. Interestingly, later they were welcomed back in, but it was the decade or two. Interestingly, Arminius's followers created what they called the 5 Articles of Remonstrance to explain their beliefs in even the smallest bit of human free will. And that inspired Dutch Calvinists to create their own 5 points of Calvinism. Perhaps you've heard of the acronym TULIP, for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Maybe you have not heard of TULIP, but now you have. And that is that's the quick mnemonic for remembering the 5 points of Calvinism. In summary, our spiritual ancestors who were liberal, or in the liberal or heretical wing of New England Puritanism, they were both Arian with an I and Arminian. Some New England Unitarians were even going so far as to believe that Jesus was simply a man, a perfect prophet, but not especially divine compared to any other person. This kind of theology, this Christology, went beyond what Arius all that long time ago would have been saying. Perhaps the first modern Christian to propose that Jesus was a person like you and me was 16th century Italian-Polish biblical scholar Fausto Sozzini. Sozzini met with Unitarians in Transylvania. They were contemporaries in the 16th century, and his writings eventually made their way to England and then to the New England colonies in the 1700s. Okay, but now we're back in the time period we started in. Though fissures were beginning in Massachusetts Puritan standing order churches and between the ministers in the 18th century, a real break didn't happen until the 19th century. As UU scholars and ministers, Reverend Andrea Greenwood and Reverend Mark Harris put it, the split between the ranks began to happen in isolated places when a new minister was called into service or when a conflict needed to be resolved. Uh, Often, if there were a divide within a church or a parish, a second parish would be founded. For example, in Needham, the West Village Church was founded shortly after the Revolutionary War and is today the Congregational Wellesley Village Church. Similar sort of quiet splits occurred in nearby in Worcester, Taunton, and Plymouth. The quiet split could also be seen between ministers who might refuse to exchange pulpits, which was a common practice at the time, or to attend gatherings with one another. Our former minister, Reverend John Behrens, wrote that most of Boston's churches were becoming liberal in part because of the successful merchants of Boston, that they generally did not want to be told from the pulpit that they were utterly depraved and in need of redemption by divine grace. Instead, they preferred hearing the Arminian assumption of free will and exhortations to use their success for good moral and civic ends, following Jesus by performing works of disinterested benevolence. But before 1800, Boston only had exactly one declared Unitarian church, and that was King's Chapel, which had been the first Anglican church founded in New England. James Freeman, pictured here, arrived at King's Chapel soon after his graduation from Harvard College. He was not ordained at the time, but was hired as a lay reader and leader there. As UU scholar Conrad Wright phrases it, over a period of 2 years, Freeman's views on the Trinity so changed that he expected he would be obliged to resign his post. But after he stated his position on the subject in a series of sermons, the congregation voted in 1785 to amend the liturgy of the Anglican prayer book, bringing it into conformity with Freeman's views, removing references to the Trinity and instead putting in phrases about Jesus's humanity. And Freeman was Socinian, not Arian. He believed that Jesus was a man rather than a superangelic being, though chosen of God to be in a unique way the channel of divine revelation. King's Chapel ended up ordaining Freeman without the consent of the Episcopal Church in 1787, and he was very influential on the liberal Puritans of the time that were neighbors with him. And they still use this adapted, at King's Chapel in downtown Boston, they still use this adapted Book of Common Prayer today. And now we really get into the Puritan split, beginning with my graduate school alma mater. The Hollis Chair or Professorship of Divinity is the oldest endowed collegiate chair in the United States, established at Harvard in 1721. The third incumbent had died in 1803. As Conrad Wright wrote, there was clearly no stronger candidate for the Hollis Chair than the distinguished minister of Hingham's First Parish, the Reverend Henry Ware Sr. But Ware was known to be a liberal. Indeed, he had collaborated in preparing a catechism that was clearly Arian in its Christology. As Greenwood and Harris wrote, a vacancy existed in the professorship, but President Joseph Willard had delayed the discussion of a successor because Ware's candidacy made him proclaim he would sooner cut off his hand than lift it up for an Armenian professor. And then Willard died. And Ware, who had been minister at Hingham for 17 years, was elected to the Hollis Chair in 1805. And then a liberal was elected president of the college the following year. This is mathematics and science professor Reverend Samuel Weber, the first of 100 years of Unitarian presidents of Harvard. Going back to Wright's history, after Weber and Ware were both installed, the Orthodox deemed Harvard unfit to prepare men of their persuasion for the ministry, and so they founded Andover Seminary in 1807. This is now Andover Newton Theological School that was previously in Newton, and now was part of Yale Divinity School. After Andover Seminary was founded in 1807, soon after, Harvard founded its own specific divinity school, my alma mater, within itself in 1816. So now the two different wings of the Puritan ministers, they're not even going to school together. Two of the earliest public Arians and Arminians in New England were these gentlemen, Reverend Joseph Stevens Buckminster and Reverend Andrews Norton. Buckminster was an intellectual prodigy and a PK, a preacher's kid. He had graduated from Harvard College at age 16 in 1800. In his years teaching the classics at what is now Phillips Exeter Academy, and then as a private tutor in Waltham, Buckminster prepared for the ministry by attending services at the already Unitarian King's Chapel and studying more advanced work in biblical criticism being carried on in Europe, and especially in Germany, that had not gotten any attention yet in the United States. I'll talk a little bit more about biblical criticism in a moment. Though Buckminster's father, who was conservative, thought that the young Joseph was becoming too heretical to be ordained, as Conrad Wright describes it in 1804, Joseph Stevens Buckminster was examined by the Boston Association and called soon after to the pulpit of one of the most distinguished congregations in the city, the Brattle Street Church. He was already settled as its minister when he marked his 21st birthday. While serving Brattle Street, Buckminster became the first American to read and translate German research on the authorship and proper translation of Christian scriptures. This is biblical criticism, eventually passing on 3,000 volumes of European biblical criticism to his peers in Boston. Buckminster was appointed to the newly established Harvard Lectureship in Biblical Criticism in 1811, but sadly he died after years of ill health in 1812, not long after he turned 28. But Buckminster was succeeded in that lectureship by Reverend Andrews Norton, who remained at Harvard for the rest of his life as a professor and librarian. Norton was one of the first liberal Puritans to publicly publish his anti-Trinitarian views, and he trained many of the ministers with whom he'd later collaborate on founding the American Unitarian Association. In the early years of the AUA, Norton would be known as the Unitarian Pope. But unfortunately, history mostly remembers poor Professor Norton for his vigorous opposition to transcendentalism. This is a caricature of Norton done by one of his students. This is depicting Norton debating the illustrator's classmates, George Ripley and Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Harvard was taken over by liberals. Arminian and Arian views were spreading in Massachusetts. And then in 1818, there was a church that refused to simply go off quietly to found a second parish. So this is now we have to remember, what we were talking about earlier, that in New England Puritan congregations, the church was the converted body of believers, the official members, and then the entire town was considered part of the parish. And one of the only things the parish got to vote on was the new minister. Well, just next door to us in Needham, in Dedham, the parish called Reverend Alvin Lamson to be minister, and the church tried to veto their vote, but failed to. As the Unitarian Universalist Association summarizes it, that's when Deacon Baker of the liberal camp in church membership sued Deacon Fowles of the Orthodox camp for the return of all the church property because Fowles and the other conservatives, the Orthodox, literally stole all the church silver and all of their documents and like ran off with it. They were just going to build a new church. They were the real church. They got to keep all the stuff. So Fowles and the church majority claimed that the assets were property of the church. And since the majority of the church was leaving, the assets were theirs to take. Baker and the liberal church minority, along with the parish, maintained that the assets belonged to the parish. And as the parish majority was staying at First Parish, they would like all of their assets returned. And the liberal minority prevailed in court. A jury ruled that according to the law, the church was built and run at the parish's expense for the benefit of the whole parish, and the minister worked for the benefit of the whole parish. Therefore, the parish owned the assets, and what's more, the parish had the right to call the minister. as the AUA phrases it, some cried foul, noting that the presiding judge, Isaac Parker, was himself a Unitarian, but when all the appeals were finally over in 1821, the ruling stood. Historians do note that Reverend Lamson was heartbroken that he couldn't keep the Dedham Church together. And how mad were the Congregationalists, the Orthodox Puritans, who just lost that court case? They were this mad. Look at this. In addition to the beautiful old rock walls we find in every corner of New England, my other favorite geographic oddity, unique to New England, is when the church, whether Unitarian or Congregational leaning, the ones who left the parish, they left and then they built their new sanctuary very aggressively right across the street from the parish church and facing it. So this is a Google Earth image of First Parish in Dedham, when we were just talking about, and then Allen Congregationals. You see across the street facing them. That's how they felt about losing their original church building and all the silver. But I wonder if any of you caught that word in the prior slide, the neat spelling bee word, which is anti-disestablishmentarianism. If, like me, you don't know what that word means, but you remember it from spelling bee days, it is being politically opposed, anti, to removing, disestablishing, state support of a specific religion or denomination. So I bet you can guess which side our Unitarian ancestors in the standing order churches, which side they were on. They were staunch anti-disestablishmentarians because we got the parish tax money. As long as we'd won the parish, as the Unitarians did in Dedham. But there were also already many Universalist congregations in Massachusetts, and they were especially vocal and persistent about disestablishment, especially our Universalist ancestors up in Gloucester, like Reverend John and Judith Sargent Murray. And alas, beginning in 1833, in the wake of the Baker versus Fales case, state support of first parishes of the standing order churches was indeed finally disestablished. By the time of young Jared Sparks' ordination in Baltimore, this is another Harvard College grad. There's a whole building named after him now. It's where the minister of Harvard's church lives. By the time of young Jared Sparks' ordination in Baltimore, Orthodox and liberal Puritans were frequently throwing all sorts of insults at each other. And the word Unitarian was one of those insults, though the debate about Calvinist predestination and Arminian free will was just as important theologically to the Puritan ministers. Unitarian was the primary insult hurled at the liberals. And that was the case until Sparks's ordination in 1819, when the prominent Boston preacher, Reverend William Ellery Channing, reclaimed the word Unitarian in his groundbreaking sermon, Unitarian Christianity. This is a lot of excerpts. I'm like, that is a lot. You can give these a little look. So these are two quotes pulled from what is a very long sermon, the Unitarian Christianity sermon, that demonstrate how Channing argued both for Unitarian theology and Arminian free will. This was Channing's effort to make the liberals' theology clear and known and established in the Bible. Tens of thousands of copies of this sermon were sold at the time. In Unitarian Christianity, the sermon, Channing described the Bible as a book written for men in the language of men, whose meaning is to be sought in the same manner as that of other books, and that he defended the use of reason in religion. And so he lifted up these conclusions from what he considered a reasoned study of the scripture. He said accurately that nowhere does the New Testament's word for God mean three persons, that it is a later theological as you all heard, decision made by a council under Constantine, and that the doctrine of predestination makes of men machines. Let's see. So on the Unitarian side, we do then with all earnestness, though without reproaching our brethren, protest against the irrational and unscriptural doctrine of the Trinity. To us, there is one God, even the Father, and with Jesus we worship the Father, the only living and true God. This is the part where it's like, oh yeah, we're not reproaching at all. We're astonished that any man can read the New Testament and avoid this conviction that the Father alone is God. Okay. On the Arminian side, the highest object of Christ's mission is the recovery of men to virtue or to holiness. We believe that all virtue has its foundation in the moral nature of man, that is, in conscience, or in his sense of duty, and in the power of forming his temper and life according to his conscience. We reject the doctrine of irresistible divine influence on the human mind, which goes along with, I'm trying to see if it's in here, all the tulip stuff, that people are not totally depraved. There's not an irresistible grace choosing whether they're elect or not elect. And here's this, that this makes men machines, and that they cast on God the blame of all evil deeds. So most of the people in his audience at the time would have agreed with him, those in Baltimore. And this did make him, I know I already said that Norton was the Unitarian Pope, but Channing was certainly one of the most influential Unitarians at this time period and in the creation of the American Unitarian Association. Channing had already been fought over, similar to Buckminster, fought over for the Unitarian ministry. When he was 23 in 1803, he was ordained by the Federal Street Church in Boston. That's now the Arlington Street Church, where once upon a time I did my ministerial internship training, and Channing served that congregation until his death. After he preached Unitarian Christianity, which the UU Dictionary of Biography, Harvard Square Library, calls a rigorous repudiation of the Calvinist doctrines of total depravity, predestination, eternal damnation, united with his invigorating affirmation of human freedom and human dignity. He then, in 1820, invited his other liberal-minded colleagues to his parsonage to form an organization that could unite the liberal clergy, and that became the Berry Street Conference, which is an interesting way of having an organization. It was actually, and it was and is, an annual essay and lecture about liberal religion. It still continues to this day, annually, every year in June at the UU Ministers Association's Ministry Days convening. He also then went on the following year with some of his peers, founding the Christian Register, which is a predecessor to the UU World. Channing was also a bridge between, unlike Norton, a bridge between the first Unitarians and Transcendentalists. He served alongside or down the street from a number of them. And his pulpit orations, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, were kind of a public conscience. Oh, I guess I thought I had in here. I don't know where it is. As some of you probably know, the only real mark against Channing in his ministry was that he did indeed, as Reverend Burens wrote, have a lot of successful merchants of Boston at the Federal Street Church. And he was very slow among his colleagues in Boston, the Unitarians, to condemn enslavement and proclaim an abolitionist stand. And once he did, his congregation, though they did not fire him, began to badly mistreat him. And his health really declined from that point on. Okay, here we go. So now we're leading up to that fateful day, May 25th of 1825. You might remember Henry Ware Sr., who had been appointed to the Hollis Chair of Divinity at Harvard some years earlier. This is his son, Reverend Henry Ware. And I think, though I'm not 100% confident, that in the background of this portrait done by Sarah Goodridge, that is the New Brick Church, Second Church of Boston. It no longer exists. It was in the North End, and later in its history would merge with the First Church of Boston. Reverend Henry Ware was holding meetings with other liberal clergy, and also with Unitarian politicians like Representative Josiah Quincy of the Quincy branch of Unitarians. And they proposed anonymously, they proposed having a separate Unitarian organization. In Greenwood and Harris's work, their history, they talk about how it was really a bitter pill for Unitarians to consider having an entirely separate organization. This is actually not too dissimilar from Unitarians in the mid-century, 1800s, who struggled with the abolition movement and because they had lived through the American Revolutionary War. They did not want a civil war. Similarly, many of them had grown up in a unified Orthodox Puritan church. And even though there were divisions between the Orthodox and liberals, they did not want to sacrifice the unity of that organization. They had hoped that the standing order of the Congregational Churches of Massachusetts could remain a broad, tolerant, ethical group that was not divided by dogmatic truths. And as you all know, our congregation is formed around covenant. Technically, the Puritan congregations were as well. And these divisions, the Arminians and Calvinists, the Unitarians and Trinitarians, really tested whether those covenants held if there were theological differences. And they did not. But we're not there yet. First, we're going to talk about poor Reverend Aaron Bancroft. He became a prominent leader in these ongoing discussions in the 1824, 1825, leading to the proper proposal of the American Unitarian Association. He was the minister of the Second Parish in Worcester. He is the reason that there was a Second Parish in Worcester founded, as we were discussing earlier. And another Harvard graduate, from Harvard. The local, I thought this was a very interesting part of his biography. The local clergy association in Worcester dissolved when he came into town because they would rather not spend any time together, I suppose, or at least not officially. They'd rather not do that than spend any time with a rumored Arminian like Reverend Aaron Bancroft. The fateful meetings. So at Reverend William Ellery Channing's Berry Street, at his Federal Street Church in downtown Boston, that would later move to Arlington Street when the Back Bay was filled in. The Berry Street Conference that year at Federal Street Church in May of 1825, the proposal officially came to create the American Unitarian Association. And this came from Reverend Aaron Bancroft. So this is the follow-up. There had been 44 ministers and lay people meeting to consider this plan for organization. And at the Berry Street Conference of Ministers in Boston, it was finally proposed. And just the very next day, the American Unitarian Association was actually founded. Its purpose, as they said it at the time, it was only ministers together. And their purpose was to diffuse the knowledge and promote the interests of pure Christianity, one that's Arminian and Arian with an I. And this was, again, it was just members and ministers. It was not congregations as we are organized today. A lot of what they were doing was publishing tracts, to disseminate through Boston and elsewhere, similar to like often excerpts of sermons like Unitarian Christianity, to prove to others that their Christianity, the Unitarian Arminian one, was the truth. They wanted to have Reverend William Ellery Channing be the first leader, the first president of that movement, but he did not want to do that, even though this was all happening in his church and he was a supporter. Let's see. Oh no, it's too far ahead. So instead we had these folks. Oh, sorry. Okay. Reverend Aaron Bancroft, minister of the Liberal Second Parish in Worcester, became president. The secretary was nominated was Channing's associate minister, Reverend Ezra Stiles Gannett. He would also follow Channing after Channing's death. And then Nathaniel Thayer, James Walker, Lewis Tappan were also involved in the that first year of the American Unitarian Association. Here. Incorrect. There we go. Lewis Tappan, interestingly, so we'll talk a little bit about these gentlemen. Lewis Tappan was a very strong American abolitionist and was at the time of the founding of the American Unitarian Association, was Unitarian. He was very good friends with William Ellery Channing and was part of the Federal Street Church and the founder of the Massachusetts Peace Society. But later in life, he went back to being a Congregationalist and really threw himself into anti-slavery society work and more broadly, the work of abolition. I had mentioned earlier that Samuel Weber was just the first of the Harvard presidents, the 100 years of Unitarian Harvard presidents. One of the others was Reverend James Walker, who became president of Harvard College 30 years after the founding of the AUA, and at the time was serving as teacher at Phillips Exeter, working at Harvard Divinity School and serving congregations in the area. And then, should I find all my notes? Oh, Nathaniel, thank you. I was saying that everybody was from Harvard College, which is true, but so many of them were also at Phillips Exeter. Nathaniel Thayer, also from Phillips, graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy, went to Harvard, and then went on to be the Unitarian minister in Lancaster, and eventually became a representative in the Massachusetts State House. Okay. Oh, I think everything's blocked. Things are not blocked now. Here's an odd bit of history. It so happens that the British and Foreign Unitarian Association was founded on the exact same day, May 25th, 1825. What you see here is Essex Street Chapel, the original headquarters for the British and Foreign Unitarian Association, what is now the modern Free General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. Speaking of disestablishment, the Church of England is definitely still established. And for our congregants who have spent time in or grew up in the United Kingdom, it's still organized by Church of England parishes. And for a long time, it was very difficult to be a Unitarian in Britain. And the reason that their congregations were called chapels is because they are not Church of England churches. No, right. Now I get to look through this as well. So a year later, I'll just share with you a little bit from the notes from the Executive Committee of the American Unitarian Association at their very first meeting, official meeting in 1826. And so, it is this. Okay. So this is a bit from Reverend Ezra Stiles Gannett, Associate Minister at Federal Street Church. The American Unitarian Association was established from a persuasion that the time had arrived when it was necessary for those who profess the simple unity of God to adopt measures differing in some respects from those which they have heretofore pursued. By a difference in measures, we mean that the circumstances of the times requires a more systematic union and a concentration of labors by which interest may be awakened, confidence inspired, and efficiency produced. This is for the want of a union among Christians in our denomination. It's felt to be a great evil by those who have directed their attention at this subject. All of which are zealously employed in disseminating their peculiar tenets. If we should allow them to fail in exercising their due influence for the want of corresponding zeal and interests, but our exertions have been apparent since this founding. The contributions of our many friends have been thrown into the treasuries of other denominations of Christians. We feel confident that there are among us men of zeal and energy who are willing and able to exert themselves in the cause of our religion. All that's required is that they be brought together and be made acquainted with each other's view and feelings, that they may be allowed to unite their labors in one common field and for one common end, and thereby warm each other's hearts and strengthen each other's hands. To produce this concert among Unitarians is one of the objects of the American Unitarian Association. Later, Gannett spends a good amount of time congratulating them for various things they've accomplished in the last year, which is mostly pamphlets. But they also at that time commissioned Reverend Joseph Tuckerman, who was another Harvard guy, a fellow Unitarian minister in their area. They commissioned him to be the leader of charitable endeavors for Boston Unitarian churches. And if his name sounds in any way familiar, it might be because that organization, coming out of this 1826 meeting that Joseph Tuckerman led, that organization is now the UU Urban Ministry of downtown Boston, that does more systemic justice work than just charity these days. But their origins go right to the beginning of the American Unitarian Association of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Okay. I thought this was probably a lot. So I made this timeline about the Puritan split and the AUA founding. I didn't know actually technologically how to bring it back any farther to Arminius and Calvin, or even to, and certainly not to Arius and Athanasius. So here we are. So you see here, we've got King's Chapel becoming Unitarian, 1785, Harvard being lost by 1807. Oh, no. The Dedham case in 1818, so kicking off disestablishment. The Baltimore Sermon delivered in 1819, Channing establishing the Berry Street Conference in 1820, and then the Christian Register magazine in 1821. Henry Ware Jr. and Josiah Quincy meeting with others in the Anonymous Association to propose a separate Unitarian group. And then the AUA founded with Aaron Bancroft of Worcester as its president. and this other group of gentlemen as the first executive committee. And then you see here the end of the standing order in 1833. We stopped getting taxes from the town. Ooh, that's right. I have a video for you all. Oh my gosh, I completely forgot about this. Are you guys ready? I have a video for you all, and then maybe we'll actually have time for questions. That's what it looks like. So this was from both the United Kingdom Unitarians and the American Unitarian Universalists and their respective denominational leaders. Let's hope this actually works. Let's see.
It is such a gift to be together. I'm the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt. It is my privilege to serve as
And now I think we'll have time for questions. Is there? Yeah. So we have a little bit. I think we do. I'll stop sharing my screen and then maybe we can talk to each other if there are any questions to be had. Hello.
Okay.
Oh, there was a chat. Oh, okay.
Well, that was really an interesting overview of the history of Unitarianism. And when I think I found it very especially interesting because so much of it happened in Boston. And so it feels very personal and very connected. Um, were there You talked about abolitionists. Were there other societal factors that helped move this along or slowed it down?
The split.
Yes,
Oh, well, then the abolition movement really was later
later,
than our
right,
split.
right.
Yeah, this was really primarily a theological situation. Uh, I think that in John's book, I have all these books around me. In John Buren's book, not our current John, our former John Buren's, in the Universalists and Unitarians in America. I think it was in there that the claim that there were like geographic and economic splits between the more conservative or the more liberal Puritan congregations. But in all these resources, that really only came up once. It was sort of like
Yeah,
the ministers were moving in different directions, and either the church and parish went with them or not. Um, yeah, the social issues like abolition would not have come into play for
right,
another little bit.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you mentioned the ships, the all
Oh, the merchants.
the
Yeah.
merchants,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that had to have some play there too.
Yeah. I realized I could actually. When was it that I'm like, when did Channing uh declare his abolitionist sentiments? Because that was oh, oh yeah, so that would have been in the 1830s.
Mm.
Um he al- so there were already other Unitarian ministers in the area, in the Boston area, that were talking about abolition earlier than Channing was, yeah, but it was still in the 1930s by the time he was kind of getting into trouble with his congregation for coming out as an abolitionist. And his childhood was he was exposed to enslavement in a way that a lot of folks in Boston were not. He spent time actually in Virginia when he was younger, um, like both to learn and to tutor around the time of his father's death. And when he was younger, he had a African American nanny who was a formerly enslaved person.
Mm.
And so these sort of early childhood encounters with um, folks who had been oppressed by enslavement um, did push him in that direction, but he was very quiet about it compared to some of his colleagues early on. Oh, bye, Courtney. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Feel free just to unmute and go ahead and ask.
Hi, thank you,
Hi.
Kate.
Yeah.
That was interesting. I'm sorry that I was late.
You're all right. Maybe you just missed all of the really old stuff.
I missed the old stuff. Um, so I wanted to know like if you could place Ralph Emerson
Oh,
in in all of this, because it seemed like he had left the Unitarian Church a little bit earlier.
no, he
Um,
didn't. Oh,
he
no.
never left it.
Well,
Oh,
no, he wasn't, he didn't leave earlier than this.
oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
Because let's see, what was his?
Well, I have always been I've always really wanted to I just know why, because I've read some of his Harvard Divinity School address, which
Yeah.
was so controversial.
Yes.
And I look at it, I guess, from a modern perspective and think to myself, what was so controversial about this? I mean, it really didn't seem, it wasn't terrible, but he was absolutely, shunned for it.
Yeah. Yes. Well, so what I'm doing is looking up quickly all the dates for this because all these things are happening around the same
Yeah.
time. You saw that
It was the
yeah,
1830s somewhere, right?
exactly. The 1830s. See, all these exciting things happened a decade later. We could have a whole other Lane Lyceum about the wild 1830s and Unitarianism.
Yeah.
You remember in the presentation there was that caricature of Andrews Norton, like
Yeah.
arguing actually with
Oh, yes,
Ralph
yes, yes.
or Waldo, we could say. So Ralph Waldo, he graduated from college and then became minister of Second Church in Boston, actually realizing another connection with these early Unitarians. So he became minister of Second Church and then was really struggling with the ritual of communion in his own personal spiritual life. And told his congregation that he could no longer serve communion. And they were like, okay, well, then you're fired. So, but he also, by my understanding, and again, I didn't look this up for this presentation, so
Yeah.
you might look this up later and be like,
Yeah,
Reverend,
probably.
that's an awful rumor about Ralph. My understanding is that Ralph Waldo Emerson, though a celebrated lecturer and writer, was like a terrible pastor. So I think Second Church was not sad to have a good reason to be like, okay, well, bye.
Made it easy for them.
Made it easy. But that was real because they had just like at the time of like Emerson and Alcott and Thoreau, the Peabody sisters, like the folks who were involved in the Transcendentalist movement, that happened really like a decade later from the establishment of the American Unitarian Association. So there were a lot of strong feelings about like we just got our own situation here, and now you all are coming in with your like nature-based spirituality, and like you read holy texts from India and getting all these ideas about direct contact with divinity, acquaint thyself firsthand with with God, instead of using Christian scripture.
So that was pretty radical. That was pretty radical.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
It was less about have a relation, like the radical part is less about having a direct relationship with God than which already in the Protestant tradition was radical in the 1500s because you didn't have to go through a priest. So that was already established. But the idea that you maybe didn't need scripture, or that like you could find some of that communion with God through nature.
Right. So that there was like we had some innate intuition about the divine.
Yes. And the idea that God might not be personal, like might not have like a personality.
Oh, interesting.
That was also very controversial at the time.
Interesting.
I'm not pulling these.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
interesting.
Yeah. But we'll have to I've thought sometimes about having if there would be interest in the congregation reading some of it's sort of like well known but not necessarily well read like Unitarians. We could read this together. No, we don't have to. This is the first volume of the documentary history of Unitarian Universalism, edited by my former professor Dan McCannon, who is just the most wonderful person. But there are a lot of works by folks like Emerson and Thoreau and folks who were Unitarian, but are not as well known to be Unitarian transcendentalists, like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Louisa May Alcott from the same time period, and Margaret Fuller. There are things that we could read from them together and be like, what was radical about this, and like what seems to our eyes and ears now to be very old-fashioned, like orthodox.
Right. Oh, thank you.
I also want to acknowledge, if he doesn't mind, I did get an email from someone on this call. It was Charles about the Universalist Church of America. I could not add that in today. They were much better. The Universalists were much more eager to have organizational and institutional unity and clarity. Like, they did have proclamations of faith. They organized by congregations and not by like random ministers. It's a very different history, and coming out of a different governance system, because they were not standing order. There were not standing order congregations that were universalist. So they were mostly coming out of like Methodist and Baptist. So they had a very different way of doing things in the United States than the Unitarians who had been standing order congregations, what they were up to. So, but maybe one day, Charles. Charles, did you have another question? I don't know. No, everybody's.
Thank you, Reverend Catie. Yeah, I sort of thought of asking if there were any correspondence between Universalists and during the formation period of the Unitarians. Were there any, like, I think Channing was going a little farther than some Unitarians, and wasn't he in the openness to everyone? I don't know how to explain it, but it seemed like he was going a little farther than some Unitarians, more of a love embracing all, sort of similar to Universalists. So I wondered if he corresponded with any known Universalists anyway.
Oh, well, yes, but not nicely.
Okay.
Was so Channing, again, was he was sort of a bridge between like the new establishment Unitarians and Transcendentalists. So he did have some more radical ideas than the other guys in the 1820s. But he was, as you saw in the little excerpt from Unitarian Christianity, that he really believed that predestination of any kind, like made man machines. Like, what's the point if we're predestined? There's a great, oh my gosh, Dan had us read this. My professor, Dan McCannon, had us read a novel from the 1800s called A New England Tale by Catherine Sedgwick. If I have any of this information correct, I'm very impressed with myself. But in this, I know that the title was A New England Tale. And Channing, like in this like fictional plot of A New England Tale, Channing believed that if you believed in predestination, there was absolutely no reason to like be moral, and anytime anything bad happened, you would just get convinced that you weren't elect, and then why would you even try? And that if you believed in free will, then and that you would earn your place in heaven, that drives people to be good people. And these are like major plot points in, or like character development issues in A New England Tale. So Channing and Hosea Ballou, I think what I remember is that they never actually met in person. Like, they never met each other. But that Channing wrote like really mean pamphlets about Hosea Ballou and what the Universalists believed, and that Ballou wrote less mean but still disagreeable pamphlets about Channing and the Unitarians. So not nearly as bad as the correspondence between, say, Miguel Cerveto and John Calvin, but still just as like back and forth. But also, maybe my recollection, it wasn't even necessarily to each other. It was like through pamphlets, like through tracts. So they, because they disagreed, actually both on Unitarian versus Trinitarian and Arminian versus Calvinist. It's one of the reasons that the two denominations, though today we're like, oh, we make so much sense together. They didn't make sense together at all in the 19th century. Did that answer the question? Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It is fun though. If you dig enough in Google Books and in the library, because people wrote, letter writing was such a major form of communication then, and folks usually would like keep a copy for themselves. There's very interesting correspondence just like between Unitarians and Universalists broadly in the 1800s. I was just looking at Emily Dickinson, as I quoted her poem "Hope is the Thing with Feathers" this past Sunday, and I think it was that she was really good friends, but like didn't actually ever meet each other really, because she lived, because of her agoraphobia. I think that she was very good friends with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who's a cool guy. If you want to read about him one day. Maybe it was Theodore Parker. Maybe it was both of them. She was alive at the same time as all these guys. There's a lot of letters. So. Does anyone else have questions for me before we wrap up? I was going to show you all a single slide of all the resources I quoted.
Reverend Catie.
Yes, yeah.
So Congregationalists, where do they fit in? I assume that they're the Puritans that did not split off into Unitarians.
Yes. Sorry.
When did they change into Congregationalists from Puritans, or
when we broke up with them? They were there. So the United Church of Christ is a merged, I mean, similar to the Unitarian Universalist Association. The United Church of Christ is a united like denomination of Christian denominations, including the Congregationalists of New England. And so the West Parish of Needham is now the Wellesley Village Church affiliated with the United Church of Christ. And the Congregational Church of Needham was founded as a congregational church. My understanding that you would have to ask Reverend John Gage. My understanding is that technically congregational and UCC churches are still both Trinitarian and Calvinist, but I don't know if they care as much about or if they feel as deeply about the Calvinist part as they once did. But yeah, that's why most New England towns have either, or especially Massachusetts, why most Massachusetts towns at the town green have either a Unitarian church or a United Church of Christ congregation. And sometimes in Dedham, it's both of them in that awkward orientation. You're like, why are you across the street from each other? That's so weird. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this was great, and we thank you for all of the work that you put into this. This is a huge endeavor.
Oh my gosh. So many books.
I'm glad that we've got it recorded so people will be able to listen to it, and we thank you for sharing all of this information with us.
Absolutely. Well, and here, so it's for the record. Here's a bunch of stuff that I at least looked through. Sometimes I didn't get to, you heard me cite some things and not other things. It's just like, this is too many things. But these are the things that I looked over. I got to tell you that the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biographies and the Harvard Square Library websites are like just wonderful resources if you want to read very involved biographies of a bunch of old Unitarians. All right, that's all then.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for being here. It was so wonderful to see you all, and thank you for asking great questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
thank you.